It's my pleasure today. I guess I'm not sure it's a pleasure, but I want to stand here and speak to the budget. And after going throughout Random, Buren, and St. George's for an extended season, I must say, thanks to the Prime Minister who chose to prorogue the House of Commons so that we weren't back here to deal with some of these issues that have been raised in the budget. I learned from my constituents a lot of the issues that they're dealing with and why it is they're having the problems that they're having. And a lot of it points to the lack of leadership, I'm told, by this Conservative government. And the reality is that my constituents continue to tell me that unless that leadership is there on issues and policies and programs that are, I guess, controlled or maintained by the federal government, unless the federal government is more cognizant of issues impacting particular people who live in rural communities, then they're never going to be able to get out of the bind they're in. And they're asking, as I meet with them, as I do every weekend, but particularly over that extended period this summer, to bring forward their concerns, to see if it isn't possible for this government to get its head out of the sand, to start listening to Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and to recognize that there are people who are having a difficult time. There are people who are finding it hard to make ends meet. So they've asked me to bring forward their concerns, hoping that the government will listen and will take into account. And they're certainly not at all impressed when they look at a budget bill that has so much in it that it's hard for parliamentarians to decipher it and take the time needed to go through it bill by bill by bill. So how is it that they can expect Canadians to do so? Particularly Canadians who live in rural communities, some of whom don't even have access to the internet, some of whom have no way of finding out what's in this budget bill unless their members of parliament convey to them what it contains and explain to them what it contains. But at the same time, it's hard for members of parliament to get that message across because, of course, there's so much in the budget. So again, we see where a Conservative government has put forward a budget that does not take into account the concerns of Canadians, no matter where they live in our country. The Budget Implementation Act and the surrounding debate is further evidence that this government just does not get it. Rather than congratulating itself on mediocrity, the government should focus its efforts on ensuring families in Random, Buren, St. George's and the rest of Canada do not continue to struggle. The fact that Canada's fiscal situation is better than that of Spain or Greece doesn't change the reality for those in my riding who are without a job through no fault of their own, or for those adult children, or for those whose adult children have moved back home because there are no employment opportunities for them, or they are underemployed and, of course, cannot afford to live independently, so they end up living with their parents. At events, again, throughout my riding, constituents have told me they are tired of being ignored by this Conservative government. They expect better, and so they should. Right. Bill C-4, sadly, is just more of the same omnibus legislation that Canadians from coast to coast to coast have come to expect, but not accept, from Conservatives out of touch with the real needs of people who try desperately to make ends meet. But they find themselves falling behind because of the measures being enacted by this Conservative government. At a time when the Bank of Canada is cutting its growth and inflation estimates across the board and warning, and I quote, the risk of exacerbating already elevated household imbalances, end quote, this government introduces legislation and uses rhetoric showing they are completely ambivalent to the fact that Canada's economic growth is rapidly slowing. After 18 consecutive months cautioning investors that the bank would soon be raising the interest rate from 1%, the Bank of Canada has been forced to drop the rate hike talk altogether to try to stimulate investment or risk compounding the weak economic outlook caused by this Conservative government. The Bank of Canada even pushed back its projected target for Canada's economy to return to full production 6 months later than it had recently forecast. In fact, the Bank of Canada now predicts the economy will return to full production. At the same time, Canadians will return to power the Liberal government in 2015.
Hear, hear.
At a crucial point in Canada's economic future, This Conservative government has once again failed to put forward a Budget Implementation Act to grow the economy and help create jobs. Liberals have for years called on the government to freeze its scheduled employment insurance premium hikes. Finally, the Conservatives are reversing their ill-timed tax hikes on Canadian jobs, which would have made it more expensive for employers to hire those in need of work. And while I'm relieved the government has decided to heed the Liberal advice and freeze EI premiums for the next 3 years, after years of steadily increasing the cost workers and employers must pay into the program, freezing EI premiums for the next 3 years won't make up for the billions of dollars in increases the Conservatives forced on employees and employers to pay during this fragile economy. If the Conservatives truly wanted to address the problems with employment insurance, which they created, they would have used Bill C-4 to reverse the punishing changes they made to the EI program last year. EI is still inaccessible to thousands of Canadians who need it, even though they paid into the program. And although this Budget Implementation Act contains a number of provisions that were not in the initial budget document, such as many of the technical tax measures in Part 1 of this Act, it is telling the Conservatives are unwilling to use Bill C-4 to take action to make EI more accessible to those who need the support. Furthermore, the Conservative government has completely ignored the need to address the factors driving high unemployment and underemployment, as well as the need for improving skills training and education. The only time this budget addresses skills is when it changes the name of the Department of Human Resources and Skills Development to the Department of Employment and Social Development. And this is a sign that the government is no longer interested in skills training. There are still too many jobs without skilled Canadians to fill them, and trying to push programs on provinces' employers without consultation will simply not result in the skills training needed. Canadians need a government committed to helping create jobs for Canadians. And I say help create, because it is a partnership. We don't expect the government to create all the jobs. We expect them to make it possible and make an environment exist where jobs can be created. They also need a government whose priority is to ensure Canadians receive the training they need to fill existing vacant jobs. Not surprisingly, as I alluded to previously, this Omnibus Budget Implementation Act contains many changes that have nothing to do with Budget 2013. That's right. It is a sad state of affairs when the Finance Minister cannot even answer questions on his own legislation, instead opting to refer questions to other ministers because the government has squeezed so many disparate bills into Bill C-4, including major public service labour changes and modifications to the appointment of Supreme Court judges. While the Finance Minister claims this is the, and I quote, mechanics of government, the truth is it is easier for the Conservatives to restrict debate and avoid scrutiny if they lump dozens of bills together, which has become the hallmark of this government. Unfortunately, that is so. When you combine legislation in this way to avoid transparency, mistakes are bound to happen. For example, this bill fixes an error in the last budget, where the government mistakenly included a disincentive to fishermen working non-fishing jobs in the off-season by discarding fishing income for their calculation of EI benefits for those who worked 421 hours or more in a non-fishing job. As many members of this House prepare to attend Remembrance Day events in their ridings, we cannot allow this government's continued attack on veterans to go without proper scrutiny. Bill C-4 cuts the number of members sitting on the Veterans Review and Appeal Board from 29 to 25. Worse, we know that under the Conservatives, only slightly more than 50% of board positions are presently filled. This board is tasked to, and I quote, provide veterans and other applicants with an independent avenue of appeal for disability decisions made by Veterans Affairs Canada, end quote. From time to time, far too many veterans know firsthand Veterans Affairs Canada makes mistakes that they need to have to review. And Mr. Speaker, that will continue as long as this government refuses to acknowledge the fact that services are being cut to the most vulnerable in our country, and it doesn't matter what part of the country you live in, but particularly in our rural communities. So while services and programs are being cut, Canadians are being made to suffer.
Yeah.